dictatorships. And Jaime Roldos came in on a populist platform. One of the things that he came in on was that he would oppose the oil companies. He would not let the oil companies rape his land anymore. And he was elected with a very substantial majority. He was a very, very popular man. As soon as he became president, he immediately started implementing what he called the hydrocarbons policy, which in Spanish that essentially translates as oil. And started negotiating with the oil companies, started telling the oil companies that they were going to have to make sure that more of the oil revenue came back to his people. And he threw out a missionary group called the Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL. Now, this was an evangelical missionary group based out of Oklahoma that had extremely close ties to oil companies that went back into the time when I was a Peace Corps volunteer and even before, in the 60s, even back to the 50s. And these missionaries were financed by oil companies. They had a long history of going in and working with the indigenous people. When the oil companies discovered or thought that there was a good possibility that oil lay under the lands lived on by indigenous people, SIL would go in and convince these people to move off their lands and onto missionary reservations and sign their lands over to the oil company. And in turn, the missionaries were financed by the oil companies. So there was this very, very cozy relationship, and SIL used some interesting techniques to get these people off the lands at times, which are described in some detail in the book. There's a number of them. I mean, it's amazing what they did. And just as one example, they would send food into indigenous villages and lace it heavily with laxatives. So the people in the village would get bad dysentery, what they thought was dysentery, and the missionaries then would come in with medicines that would very quickly cure it. Of course, they knew what caused it. It was their own laxatives, and say that God had sent them and that they were there to help the people, etc., etc. So, and there's some much more incredible things described in the books. For example, how they had an ears and eyes operation where they could actually listen to everything that was spoken in the indigenous homes and respond that way and say that God had sent them. Fascinating what they went through. Very well documented, not only in my book, but in other sources. And so one of the first things Jaime Roldos did after being elected was go after SIL and said, these people are not what they say they are, we've got to get them out, and we're going to take care of the oil companies. It was, in fact, a day that he gave a very vitriolic speech against the SIL, threw SIL out of the country that day, announced they were going to throw them out, and gave this speech against the oil companies. And either that day or a day or two later, his helicopter exploded in midair. There was, again, no question that it was an assassination, and at least not in my mind and not in the mind of many, many people. And I'd seen it coming. We economic hitmen were not getting through to Jaime Roldos. He was determined to go after the oil companies. He was determined to get for his country what he thought was the right thing, and we couldn't change him, and the inevitable happened. He was taken up by the jackals.
And again, one of the big threats, in addition to not giving us the access to all their resources, was that he would potentially become an example to the rest of the world.
Yes, absolutely. You know, the world was watching. Jaime wanted to renegotiate all the contracts with the oil companies, make sure that they gave a lot more back to the Ecuadorian people, and they could not afford to see this happen in Ecuador, because if it happened in Ecuador, everybody else around the world would know about it, and it would happen in those places too. Obviously, Peru and Colombia are neighbors to Ecuador. They would, be immediately impacted, but the news would get out through OPEC and throughout the world that Jaime had stood up to the oil companies and had won. The oil companies could not let that happen.
But you mentioned Colombia. Did you have any experience with Colombia, since we're sending so much military aid down there?
I had a lot of experience with Colombia. I spent probably a year or more living in Colombia, but over a period of maybe 5 or 6 years. I'd go there for 2 or 3 months and was very close to them. I had an office in Colombia for a short period of time. I also was in the process of buying a small coffee farm in Colombia. I loved Colombia, and I had very good friends there. And yes, Colombia is a fascinating example, because the movements that we talk about today as being driven by narcotics and terrorism started as very grassroots movements opposed to the things that we were doing. My own company was designing and managing the construction of a large hydroelectric system in Colombia. And the local people strongly opposed this project because they knew that it was damming up their rivers. It was changing everything in their environment, changing all the water resources. And they knew that the big transmission lines were going to go over their lands. They were not going to get any electricity themselves. It was all going up to the big cities, to the industries, and the industrialists, to the wealthy people. They were incensed, and so they opposed us. And a guerrilla movement started up, and would go into our camp, our construction camp, and take hostages, even to the point where our State Department demanded that our embassy in Colombia insisted that we not ever send any American engineers, North American engineers, U.S. citizens, into our own construction site. We could only send Colombians in. We had to hire Colombian engineers, and there were a lot of very good ones, to do this. And so the guerrillas would come into our construction camp and cause a lot of disruption and take hostages and so forth. And they were really had a very legitimate gripe. They were being screwed. Colombia was taking huge loans from the big international banks in order to build these facilities, to hire U.S. companies to build these facilities that were providing electricity to a few of the very wealthy families. And the peasants, the campesinos, the poor people of Colombia were going to be stuck with the loans ultimately, so it would affect their health care, their education, everything else, and they weren't getting any benefits. In fact, these projects were hurting their lands, causing tremendous disruption to them. And out of that grew this movement that had to turn someplace for training and weapons. If you're going to take on the big international oil companies and the mercenaries that they bring in, and ultimately perhaps the U.S. government, at least a lot of stuff that's funded by them, and the Colombian army and police force that's funded by the U.S. government, if you're going to do that, then you've got to get weapons and training someplace. Now, in those days, the Colombians, FARC, and there were a number of groups that grew out of this, turned to either Russia or China or Cuba. And that we thought that was pretty bad. We accused them of being communists and socialists. And in many cases, they really weren't. They just needed to get training and weapons, and that's where they got them from. But that was sort of a moderating influence on our government as long as Russia and China and Cuba were major forces. When we saw these sorts of things happening, we would also often modify our relations with countries and tone down a little bit. But as time went on, and Russia and China fell by the way, and now basically there is no worldwide communist movement. We're unopposed as a world power. The United States is unopposed today as the world empire. This has put these organizations, these grassroots people who want to resist us, in a very, very awkward position. In the case of Colombia, they've gone into drug dealing, and they'd started this a little bit before, but they've gone into drug manufacturing and dealing. They've gone into kidnapping. They've gone into extortion in order to finance their need for weapons and training. In the process, they've become very corrupted, too. A number of these organizations, too, today have simply become about drugs. They have become narco-trafficking groups, and the drug wars we're all familiar with. But what really started off as a grassroots resistance to U.S. policy of making these loans and building these projects has now mushroomed into this nightmarish situation, which is totally out of control and is no longer ideologically based. Some of it still may be, but for the most part, it's just become a huge, gang war. But it started because these people opposed us. I find this, Mike, terrifying in the overall scheme of things, today more than ever, because right now I know that my friends in the Amazon, the Shuar, the Achua, the Warani, the tribes that live in the Amazon who are opposing our oil companies and have said they will fight to the last man, they are right now being accused of being part of Al-Qaeda. Some of the nonprofit, I'm on the boards directors of several nonprofits that work in those areas. One of our nonprofits has been accused of being an Al-Qaeda operation. It absolutely is not. It's run by quite conservative people out of San Francisco. It's raised millions of dollars to help the people in the Amazon. We have nothing to do with terrorism.